He was 8 miles from home, 8 miles from his family, from safety, from everything he'd ever known. And then Arthur Vance just stopped existing. No distress call, no wreckage, no body, nothing. For 15 years, his wife lived in a special kind of hell, the hell of not knowing. Did he suffer? Did. Did he think of her in his final moments? Or was there something darker, something she couldn't even imagine? Then the water pulled back, and what emerged from that Louisiana bayou wasn't just a plane. It was proof of a betrayal so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about that November day in 1983. This isn't a story about a missing plane. This is a story about trust, murdered in midair. November 4th, 1983. Arthur Vance was doing what he'd done dozens of times before, flying his Cessna to pick up combine parts. Routine. Simple. He'd be home by lunch. But Arthur had made a discovery that week. Grain was missing from his storage facilities, a lot of it, and he'd started asking questions. Someone didn't want him to find the answers. The flight should have taken 40 minutes. When Arthur didn't return, his family assumed a minor delay. Maybe weather, maybe a mechanical issue. By nightfall, they knew something was terribly wrong. Search teams scoured the route for 2 weeks. Planes, volunteers, bloodhounds. They checked every field, every clearing, every piece of farmland between Louisiana and Mississippi. Nothing, not a scrap of metal, not a fuel stain, not a single piece of evidence that Arthur Vance's plane had ever fallen from the sky. His family offered a reward. Silence. The case went cold, the file gathered dust, and Arthur's wife learned to live with a question that had no answer. Until the drought of 1998. When the water in Bayou Macon dropped to levels not seen in decades, a hunter noticed something that didn't belong. Something angular, something metal. Something that had been hidden in plain sight, 8 miles from Arthur's home, for 15 years. The tail of a blue and white Cessna, buried at a 45-degree angle in mud so thick it had become a tomb. But here's what nobody expected. When they pulled that plane from the bayou, they didn't just find Arthur's body. They found evidence of murder. The plane was intact, too intact. When aircraft crash at high speed, they disintegrate. They shred into thousands of pieces scattered across acres of terrain. Metal twists, wings separate, fuselage explodes. Arthur Vance's plane looked like it had been gently placed into the mud. Detective Leon Gilbert stared at the wreckage pulled from Bayou Macon and felt his instincts screaming. This wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. Arthur's body was still strapped in the pilot's seat. He hadn't tried to escape, hadn't attempted an emergency landing, hadn't done anything. It was as if he'd simply stopped flying. The combine parts were in the cargo hold, perfectly secured. The flight plan had been followed exactly. Everything about this trip screamed routine, except for the fact that Arthur Vance had flown straight into a swamp and never tried to pull up. Gilbert knew what the family was thinking. Finally, closure. Finally, an answer, an accident. Tragic, but understandable. But Gilbert had worked cold cases long enough to know when something looks like an accident, you search harder for murder. He ordered a full forensic examination of every inch of that aircraft. The engine showed no catastrophic failure, no fire damage, no explosion. The fuel system was intact, the controls were functional. So why had an experienced pilot, flying a route he knew by heart in acceptable weather conditions, simply flown into a bayou without any attempt to save himself? Then the forensic team started taking apart the interior. Beneath the pilot's seat, they found the heating system, standard aluminum ducting that circulated warm air through the cabin. Nothing unusual. Except when they looked closer, deep inside one of those ducts, they found something that made Gilbert's blood run cold. A dense, grey mass. Fabric. Technical cloth, the kind used in machine shops and agricultural settings. Shop rags aren't supposed to be inside aircraft heating systems. Gilbert had the material extracted and sent to the lab with a single instruction: tell me what this is soaked in. 3 days later, the lab called back: methyl parathion, an agricultural pesticide so toxic that exposure to its fumes causes rapid poisoning, disorientation, loss of consciousness, death, and the concentration wasn't accidental. This wasn't residue from normal farm work. Someone had deliberately saturated that cloth with poison and wedged it deep into the heating duct where Arthur would never see it. Gilbert sat back in his chair and let the implications settle over him. Arthur Vance hadn't crashed. He'd been murdered in one of the most sophisticated, cold-blooded ways Gilbert had ever encountered. Whoever did this knew Arthur's plane, knew his routine, knew exactly how to make murder look like a disappearance. But why? And more importantly, who had access to that plane on November 4th, 1983? Gilbert pulled the original case files, witness statements, airport logs, names of everyone who'd been at that airstrip the morning Arthur took off. One name appeared multiple times: Clarence Reed, farm manager, business partner, the man who'd helped Arthur load those combine parts into the plane, the man who'd been alone with the aircraft while Arthur filed his flight plan. Gilbert's pen hovered over Reed's name. 15 years was a long time. Memories fade, evidence disappears, people die. But if Clarence Reed thought time had erased what he'd done, he was about to learn a brutal lesson. The Bayou had kept Arthur Vance's secret. Now it was about to give it back. Detective Gilbert didn't believe in coincidences, not in murder cases, not when money was involved. He started with a simple question: what happened to Arthur Vance's farm after he disappeared? The answer opened a door into something uglier than he'd imagined. 1 month before Arthur vanished, he'd discovered grain missing from his storage facilities. Not a little, enough to notice, enough to care. Arthur had started an internal audit. Then Arthur was gone, and the audit died with him. Gilbert pulled financial records from 1983. Bank statements, property transfers, business filings, the kind of paperwork most people assume gets lost to time. But paper trails don't lie, and what Gilbert found was a trail that led straight to Clarence Reed. 1 week after Arthur disappeared, when search teams were still combing forests and fields, when his wife was still hoping for a miracle, 200 tons of grain were sold through a company called CNR Holdings. The grain came from Arthur's storage facilities. The money went to Clarence Reed. Gilbert traced the documentation, shipping manifests, inventory identifiers. Everything matched. Reed had sold Arthur's grain the moment there was no one left to stop him. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 15 years, Reed's financial situation transformed. He bought equipment, expanded his land holdings, made acquisitions that didn't match his documented income before 1983. Reed hadn't just survived Arthur's disappearance, he'd profited from it. Gilbert leaned back and stared at the timeline on his wall. Motive, opportunity, benefit, the pieces were aligning. But knowing someone benefited from a murder wasn't the same as proving they committed it. He needed more than financial records. He needed physical evidence connecting Reed to that poison-soaked cloth. Gilbert started making calls, tracking down people who'd worked at the airport in 1983. Most were retired, some were dead. Others had moved away and couldn't remember details from 15 years ago. Then he found Jerry Mouton, former fuel attendant, still living in the same parish, still sharp as a tack. November 4th, 1983, Mouton said when Gilbert called. "Yeah, I remember that day. Everyone was talking about it after Arthur went missing. Do you remember who was at the airport that morning?" "Sure. Arthur came in early, had those heavy parts to load. Clarence Reed came with him to help." Gilbert's pulse quickened. Did Reed have access to the plane? Well, yeah. Arthur went inside to file his flight plan. Reed stayed outside with the aircraft. Must have been 5, maybe 7 minutes. Was anyone else around? Not right near the plane. I was over by the fuel pumps. Arthur was in the office. Reed was alone. 7 minutes. That's all it would take to open the cabin, reach under the seat, and shove poison-soaked cloth into the heating duct. 7 minutes to commit murder that would take 15 years to uncover. Gilbert thanked Mouton and hung up. He had motive. He had opportunity. He had witness testimony placing Reed alone with the aircraft. Now he needed the poison source. Arthur's farm was still operational, still owned by his family. Gilbert obtained permission to search the property's storage facilities, buildings that had been in continuous use since the early 1980s. If Reed had used pesticide from Arthur's own farm to kill him, there might still be evidence. The search took 2 days. Fertilizers, tools, decades of accumulated agricultural supplies. Then, in a corner of the equipment shed, wrapped in a tarp and covered in dust, Gilbert's team found it. A pesticide canister from 1983, methylparathion, the lid damaged and wrapped with electrical tape to prevent leakage. Someone had sealed that canister deliberately. Someone had preserved it. Gilbert had it sent to the lab with instructions to compare it to the residue from the aircraft. While he waited, he considered the psychological profile emerging. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated, patient, methodical. Reed had stolen grain. When Arthur started investigating, Reed didn't panic. He planned. He used Arthur's own farming supplies. He accompanied Arthur to the airport under the pretense of helping. He poisoned the plane in broad daylight with people nearby. Then he waited for Arthur to take off, waited for the heating system to activate, waited for the poison to do its work. And when Arthur's plane disappeared without a trace, Reed sold the stolen grain and began building his fortune on top of Arthur's grave. The lab results came back. Chemical match. The pesticide in the canister was identical to the residue in the aircraft. Same composition, same trace impurities, same source. But Gilbert had one more surprise waiting. On the electrical tape wrapped around that damaged lid, forensic specialists had recovered something remarkable, a partial fingerprint, preserved on the adhesive for 15 years. Now Gilbert just needed Reed's fingerprints, and a confession would be nice, but Gilbert had learned long ago, guilty men rarely confess. They don't have to. Evidence does the talking. Clarence Reed was 62 years old when Detective Gilbert knocked on his door. Successful businessman, respected in the community, owner of substantial property and equipment. He looked like a man who'd earned his comfortable life through hard work and smart decisions. Gilbert knew better. Mr. Reed, I need to ask you some questions about Arthur Vance. Reed's expression didn't change. 15 years was a long time. Most people would assume old cases stayed buried. That was a tragedy, Reed said smoothly. Arthur was a good man. When was the last time you saw him? The morning he disappeared, I suppose. I helped him load parts at the airport. You were alone with his plane while he filed his flight plan. I might have been. I don't really remember. It was 15 years ago, Detective. Gilbert watched Reed carefully. No nervousness, no tells, just calm, measured responses. We found his plane. Now there was a flicker, just a fraction of a second where Reed's composure cracked. Where? Bayou Macon, 8 miles from his home. It's been there since 1983. Reed said nothing. Calculating, processing. We found something interesting in the wreckage, Gilbert continued. Poison-soaked cloth in the heating system. Methylparathion. Know anything about that? Pesticides were common on the farm. Could have been anyone's. Except we found the source. Original canister from 1983, still on Arthur's property. Someone wrapped the lid with electrical tape to preserve it. Reed's lawyer would later say his client maintained his innocence, that he was being railroaded by circumstantial evidence and speculation. But in that moment, Gilbert saw the truth in Reed's eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, calculation. Reed was calculating whether he could still talk his way out. "I'd like to see my attorney." "Of course. But first, standard procedure. We'll need your fingerprints." Reed hesitated, just for a second, but that second told Gilbert everything. "Is that necessary?" "Completely routine, Mr. Reed, just for elimination purposes." They both knew it was anything but routine. 3 days later, the forensic report landed on Gilbert's desk. The partial fingerprint from the electrical tape matched Clarence Reed's right thumb. Reed had handled that canister. He'd sealed it. He'd preserved the evidence of his own crime. Gilbert built his case methodically. Financial records showing the grain theft and Reed's subsequent prosperity. Witness testimony placing Reed alone with the aircraft. Chemical analysis linking the farm's pesticide to the poison in the plane. And now, physical evidence. Reed's fingerprint on the container that held the murder weapon. But Gilbert wanted more than evidence. He wanted to understand the psychology. This wasn't a moment of rage. Reed hadn't struck Arthur in anger. He'd engineered a death that would look like an accident, a disappearance, anything but murder. The method required intimate knowledge. Reed knew Arthur flew alone, knew his routes, knew he'd use the heating system when temperatures dropped. He'd turned Arthur's own aircraft into a gas chamber, and he'd done it, knowing Arthur would have minutes, maybe seconds of consciousness as the poison took effect. Knowing Arthur would realize something was wrong, but wouldn't understand what. Wouldn't be able to land, wouldn't be able to save himself. That level of premeditation revealed something chilling about Clarence Reed. He wasn't just a thief protecting his scheme. He was someone who could watch a man prepare for a routine flight, knowing that man would be dead within the hour and feel nothing. Gilbert interviewed Reed's former associates, neighbors, business partners. Clarence always landed on his feet, one said. Even when times were tough, he seemed to find opportunities. He was quiet about his finances, another mentioned. Private. Didn't talk about where his money came from. After Arthur disappeared, Clarence took over managing more of the operation, a third recalled. Made sense at the time, someone had to step up. Looking back, though, he seemed almost prepared for it. Prepared. That word echoed in Gilbert's mind. Reed hadn't just reacted to Arthur's audit, he'd anticipated it, had probably been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Waiting for the right moment, the right flight. The indictment was filed in late 1999, first-degree murder. No statute of limitations. Reed pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued circumstantial evidence. They claimed the fingerprint could have been left any time Reed handled farm supplies. They suggested the financial gains were legitimate business growth. But they couldn't explain the timing, couldn't explain why grain was sold 1 week after Arthur disappeared. Couldn't explain why Reed had been alone with the plane. Couldn't explain the poison in the heating duct. Most importantly, they couldn't explain why an innocent man would need to explain any of it. The prosecution laid out the timeline with surgical precision. Theft discovered, audit initiated, murder planned, poison planted, flight departed. Arthur incapacitated, plane crashes, grain sold, fortune built. Each step connected to the next, with inexorable logic. The jury didn't deliberate long. The courtroom was silent when the jury foreman stood. Arthur Vance's widow sat in the front row, 71 years old now, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 15 years of not knowing, 16 years of waiting for this moment. We, the jury, find the defendant, Clarence Reed, guilty of murder in the first degree. Reed's face remained expressionless. Even now, even as his carefully constructed life collapsed around him, he gave nothing away. But his hands told a different story. They trembled slightly as the bailiff approached. The judge's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Mr. Reed, you have been found guilty of one of the most calculated and cold-blooded murders this court has ever seen. You didn't kill Arthur Vance in a moment of passion. You didn't kill him in self-defense. You murdered him for money. You murdered him to protect your theft. and you did it in a way that ensured his family would suffer for 15 years without answers. Reed stared straight ahead, silent. You turned his own plane into a death trap. You watched him prepare for a flight you knew he'd never complete, and then you profited from his death while his family grieved. The judge paused, letting the weight of those words settle. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Reed's attorney requested to speak. The judge allowed it. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. We plan to appeal based on... Save it for the appeals court, Counselor. This jury heard the evidence. The science doesn't lie. The financial records don't lie. And that fingerprint on the poison container certainly doesn't lie. Arthur's widow made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp of relief. Her daughter reached over and squeezed her hand. 16 years. 16 years of wondering if Arthur had suffered, if he'd thought of them, if somehow, impossibly, he might still be alive somewhere. Now she knew. He'd thought of them until the very moment consciousness left him. He'd been coming home, just 8 miles away from safety when the poison took hold, but the legal proceedings weren't finished. The family filed a wrongful death civil suit. The criminal trial had established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Now they wanted compensation for 16 years of financial and emotional damage. Reed's assets were substantial. The farm equipment, the land, the business holdings, all built on a foundation of stolen grain and murder. The court awarded Arthur's family $950,000. Reed's attorneys argued he didn't have that kind of liquid capital. The judge was unmoved. Then you'll liquidate assets, Mr. Reed. Every piece of equipment you bought with blood money, every acre of land you purchased while Arthur Vance's family grieved. It all goes to them. That's justice. Over the following months, court-appointed administrators catalogued Reed's holdings. Agricultural machinery purchased in 1984. Land acquired in 1986. Business expansions from the late 80s and early 90s. The audit revealed something darkly poetic. Reed's net worth almost precisely matched the value of what he'd stolen and the profits he'd made by eliminating Arthur as a business obstacle. He'd built his empire on one man's death. Now that empire would be dismantled brick by brick and returned to the family he'd destroyed. But money, Arthur's widow knew, couldn't bring her husband back, couldn't give her those 15 years of not knowing, couldn't erase the nights she'd lain awake wondering if he'd crashed and called out for her in his final moments. At least now she knew the truth. However painful, truth was better than the torture of imagination. The case made headlines across Louisiana and beyond. Bayou murder solved after 15 years. Drought exposes decades-old crime. Farm manager guilty in plane poisoning. But for those who studied the case more closely, the headlines missed the most disturbing element. This wasn't a crime of passion. Reed hadn't snapped, hadn't acted in a moment of fear or rage. He'd planned this with chilling patience, had probably rehearsed it mentally dozens of times, had waited for the perfect opportunity when Arthur would be flying alone, when the weather might make a crash seem plausible, when the route took him over water and swampland, where a plane could disappear. The poison itself revealed sophistication. Methylparathion didn't kill instantly, it incapacitated gradually, which meant Arthur would be airborne when symptoms became severe. No chance to land, no chance to radio for help, just a slow slide into unconsciousness followed by an uncontrolled descent. Reed had given himself plausible deniability at every turn. If the plane had been found immediately, the poison might have degraded. If it had crashed on land, the heating duct might have been destroyed. If investigators hadn't looked closely enough, they might have called it an accident. He'd calculated everything except the bayou itself. The mud that concealed the plane also preserved it. The lack of oxygen that prevented normal decomposition also protected the evidence. The very thing that made the crime seem perfect, the total disappearance of the aircraft, eventually became the mechanism of Reed's downfall. Nature had kept Arthur's secret, and when the drought came, nature had given it back. Detective Gilbert retired 3 years after Reed's conviction. The Vance case was his last major investigation, and he considered it his most important. "People think cold cases can't be solved," he said in an interview. "They think time erases evidence, but time can also preserve it. That plane sat in that bayou for 15 years, waiting. The evidence didn't go anywhere, it just waited for us to find it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Clarence Reed thought he'd committed the perfect crime, and for 15 years he was right. But there's no such thing as a perfect crime. Eventually, the truth has a way of surfacing. Just like Arthur's plane. Buried in mud, hidden from view, but not gone. Never gone, just waiting for the water to pull back and reveal what had been there all along. In 2000, Arthur Vance was finally laid to rest. His funeral was held 17 years after his disappearance. His children, now middle-aged, stood beside the grave of a father who'd been frozen in time, forever 56 years old, forever on his way home. The casket was closed. What the bayou had preserved, time had still touched. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Arthur was home. The minister spoke about justice delayed but not denied, about truth emerging even from the deepest darkness, about a man who'd lived honestly and died because of someone else's greed. But he didn't talk about what those final minutes must have been like for Arthur Vance. No one wanted to imagine that. Arthur taking off from Vicksburg, probably thinking about the harvest schedule, about getting those combine parts installed, about what his wife might have made for lunch. The first symptoms would have been subtle. Slight dizziness, fatigue. He might have attributed it to the early morning, to the physical effort of loading heavy equipment. Then the rain came, the temperature dropped, and Arthur did what any pilot would do. He turned on the heat. That's when the poison concentration spiked. Warm air flowing over the methyl parathane-soaked cloth, vaporizing the toxin, flooding the cabin with fumes that Arthur couldn't see, couldn't smell, couldn't escape. The disorientation would have intensified rapidly, his vision blurring, his thoughts scattering, his hands feeling disconnected from his brain. He was 8 miles from home, 8 miles from the private airstrip where his plane had taken off hundreds of times. He could probably see familiar landmarks below. That church steeple, that bend in the road, that water tower, almost home. But his body was shutting down. The poison attacking his nervous system, disrupting the signals between brain and muscle. His hands on the controls becoming heavier, his breathing shallow. Did he know something was wrong? Did he try to fight it? Did he reach for the radio? Or did unconsciousness take him so quickly that he simply stopped? The plane didn't nosedive, it didn't spiral, it just descended gradually, like Arthur had fallen asleep at the controls. Which, in a horrible way, he had. The impact came in a flooded section of Bayou Macon. The nose struck soft mud at an angle. The fuselage drove into the sediment, water rushed in through gaps, and the plane sank, taking Arthur with it. Above, Clarence Reed was probably back at the farm, going about his day, waiting for news that Arthur hadn't arrived home, acting concerned when the search began, offering to help, playing the role of the worried friend and employee, all while knowing exactly where Arthur was, exactly what had happened, exactly why. Arthur's widow told investigators later that she'd known something was wrong the moment he didn't come home for lunch. "Arthur was never late," she said. "Never. If he said he'd be home by noon, he'd be home by noon. When 1 o'clock came and he wasn't there, I knew. I didn't know what, but I knew something terrible had happened." She'd spent that afternoon calling the airport, calling friends, calling anyone who might have seen him. By evening, the official search had begun. For 2 weeks, she held on to hope. Maybe he'd made an emergency landing. Maybe he was injured somewhere, waiting to be found. Maybe, somehow, he was alive. Then the search was called off. and hope became something more painful: uncertainty. "The not knowing was worse than anything," she told a reporter years later. "If he died in a crash, at least I'd know. I could grieve. I could move on. But not knowing, that's a special kind of torture. You imagine every possibility. Maybe he's alive with amnesia. Maybe he's being held somewhere. Maybe he staged it all and left us. Your mind goes to dark places when you don't have answers." For 15 years, she'd lived with those questions, and Clarence Reed had watched her suffer, had watched Arthur's children grow up without their father, had watched the family struggle with the business, with the finances, with the grief, and he'd said nothing. That, perhaps, was the most damning evidence of Reed's character. Not just that he'd committed murder, but that he'd watched the aftermath and felt nothing. He'd attended the memorial service they'd held for Arthur in 1984, had stood there listening to eulogies for a man he'd poisoned, had offered condolences to a widow he'd created. Psychologists who reviewed the case later noted that this level of compartmentalization suggested either psychopathy or an ability to rationalize that bordered on delusional. Reed had probably convinced himself he'd had no choice, that Arthur's audit would have ruined him, that he was protecting himself, his future, his family. He'd reframed murder as self-preservation, theft as taking what he deserved, and 16 years of lying as simply moving on with his life. But lies have weight, and time has a way of making that weight unbearable. After Reed's conviction, a former neighbor recalled something odd. In the late 90s, right before they found the plane, Clarence had been talking about selling everything and moving to Florida, said he wanted a fresh start. I thought it was strange. He'd built such a successful operation in Louisiana. Why leave? Why indeed? Had Reed sensed something? Had the guilt finally begun eating at him? Or had he simply calculated that after 15 years he was safe and decided to enjoy his blood money somewhere with better weather? Whatever his reasoning, the drought had ruined his plans. The bayou had given up its secret, and the fresh start Reed wanted became a life sentence instead. The Vance case changed how investigators approached cold cases across Louisiana and beyond. Detective Gilbert gave lectures at law enforcement conferences, emphasizing one critical point: environmental preservation isn't just about ice or dry climates. Water, mud, and lack of oxygen can preserve evidence just as effectively. The bayou had become an accidental evidence locker, but the case raised uncomfortable questions that extended beyond forensics and police work. Questions about trust, about the people we allow into our lives, about how well we really know anyone. Arthur Vance had trusted Clarence Reed, had given him responsibility, had probably considered him a friend, or at least a reliable colleague, and Reed had used that trust to get close enough to murder him. The betrayal was as much a weapon as the poison itself. Arthur's son, who'd been 23 when his father disappeared, struggled with this realization more than anything else. "We knew Clarence," he told a journalist. "He came to family dinners. He was at birthdays. My dad trusted him completely, and the whole time he knew what he'd done." That psychological violation, the knowledge that Reed had smiled at them while hiding murder, cut deeper than the financial theft or even the loss itself. It poisoned their memories. Every interaction with Reed after November 1983 had been a lie. Every condolence, every concerned question about the search, every moment of apparent solidarity, all of it had been performance. Reed had played the role of the loyal employee and concerned friend while actively benefiting from Arthur's death. The grain he'd stolen and sold, the audit that had died with Arthur, the business opportunities that opened up with Arthur gone. Reed had seized all of it while pretending to mourn. For Arthur's family, this realization meant re-examining 15 years of memories through a new, darker lens. That moment, Reed had offered to help manage things after Arthur disappeared. He'd been positioning himself to exploit the chaos. That time he'd expressed frustration that Arthur was never found. He'd been ensuring no investigation could move forward. That conversation where he'd suggested the family move on and find closure. He'd been trying to bury the truth along with Arthur. Every word had been calculated, every gesture hollow. The family had to grieve Arthur's death twice, once in 1983 when he disappeared, and again in 1999 when they learned he'd been murdered by someone they'd trusted. But the case also revealed something else, something investigators found both fascinating and disturbing. Reed had made mistakes, small ones, mistakes that would have exposed him if investigators had known where to look. He'd sold the grain too quickly. A truly clever criminal would have waited months, maybe a year, before moving the stolen product. But Reed had been impatient, or perhaps desperate for the money. He'd kept the pesticide canister. A smarter approach would have been to dispose of it immediately, destroy any link between the poison source and himself. But Reed had sealed it and stored it, perhaps not wanting to draw attention by sudden disposal, or perhaps experiencing some twisted need to keep a trophy. And most damaging of all, he'd stayed in the area, built his life on the foundation of his crime, drew attention to his newfound prosperity. A truly calculating murderer would have taken the money and disappeared, started fresh somewhere else with a clean identity. But Reed had stayed, had watched Arthur's family struggle, had built his success in the same community where everyone knew he'd worked for Arthur. Why? Psychologists who studied the case offered theories. Some suggested Reed needed to witness the fruits of his crime, that the murder wasn't just about money but about dominance, about proving he was smarter than Arthur. Others argued he'd convinced himself he hadn't done anything wrong, that he deserved what he'd taken and therefore had no reason to hide. A third theory was simpler and perhaps darkest of all. Reed had enjoyed it, had enjoyed the secret knowledge, had enjoyed watching people search for answers he possessed, had enjoyed the power of being the only person who knew the truth. That would explain why he'd preserved the pesticide canister, why he'd stayed close, why he'd inserted himself into the family's grief. He'd wanted to be near his masterpiece, to watch it unfold, to savor his cleverness. If that theory was correct, then Reed wasn't just a murderer. He was a sadist. And his conviction hadn't just been justice for Arthur, it had been protection for whoever might have been next. Because men like Reed don't stop. They escalate. The grain theft had been small-scale embezzlement. When that was threatened, he'd escalated to murder. If he'd gotten away with it, if the plane had never been found, who's to say what he might have done if threatened again? Detective Gilbert believed Reed would have killed again if necessary. People who commit premeditated murder like this don't suddenly develop a conscience, Gilbert said. They develop confidence. Every year that passed without the plane being found, Reed became more certain he was untouchable. If someone else had discovered his schemes, if another audit had been initiated, I have no doubt he would have found another solution. And the next time, he might not have relied on a method that depended on nature concealing the evidence. He might have been more thorough, more brutal, more difficult to catch. The drought of 1998 hadn't just solved Arthur Vance's murder, it had potentially prevented others. That realization haunted Arthur's family. They'd gotten justice, but how many years had Reed lived free? How much had he profited? How many times had he looked at Arthur's grave marker, placed in 1985 at a memorial garden, even though there was no body, and smiled? The answer was too many, far too many. But there was one small comfort. In the end, the crime itself had contained the seeds of Reed's downfall. The very elements that made the murder seem perfect, the disappearance of the plane, the lack of immediate evidence, the passage of time, had also preserved the truth. The bayou had preserved what Reed tried to hide. The mud had protected the evidence he thought would decay. And the 15-year delay had given forensic science time to advance. Techniques that didn't exist in 1983 were standard procedure by 1998. Reed had committed a 1983 murder, but he'd been caught with 1998 technology. If the plane had been found immediately, investigators might not have thought to check the heating ducts so thoroughly, might not have had the chemical analysis capabilities to identify trace pesticide concentrations, might not have been able to lift a fingerprint from 15-year-old adhesive tape. Time, which Reed had counted as his ally, had actually armed his enemies. But beyond the technical aspects, beyond the forensics and the legal proceedings, the Vance case exposed something darker about human nature itself. Clarence Reed had been ordinary, middle-aged farm manager, unremarkable background, no history of violence, no red flags that would have made anyone suspect him of murder. That ordinariness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire case. Because if Clarence Reed could plan and execute such a calculated killing, if he could watch a family suffer for 15 years without confession, if he could build a comfortable life on blood money while maintaining a facade of respectability, then who else might be capable of the same? How many unsolved disappearances involve someone close, someone trusted, someone who attended the memorial service and offered comfort while knowing exactly what happened? The statistics are chilling. Law enforcement estimates that in cases of foul play, the perpetrator is known to the victim in approximately 80% of cases. Family members, friends, colleagues, business partners, people we trust, people we allow into our lives, people who know our routines, our vulnerabilities, our blind spots. Arthur had trusted Reed enough to let him near the plane unsupervised. That trust had killed him. After Reed's conviction, aviation safety experts analyzed the case for lessons that might prevent similar crimes. The FAA issued advisories about aircraft security, particularly for private planes, kept at small, informal airstrips where access wasn't tightly controlled. But the real lesson wasn't about locks or cameras or security protocols. It was about the fact that murder doesn't always look like murder. Sometimes it looks like an accident. Sometimes it looks like a disappearance. Sometimes it looks like bad luck or mechanical failure or pilot error. And sometimes the only thing standing between a perfect crime and justice is a drought that comes 15 years too late. Arthur's widow was asked near the end of her life if she'd forgiven Clarence Reed. She was quiet for a long moment. "Forgiveness is complicated," she finally said. "Can I forgive him for killing Arthur? I don't know. That's between him and God now. But can I forgive him for letting us suffer for 15 years, for watching us grieve while he knew the truth, for building his life on my husband's grave?" She shook her head slowly. "That's not something I can forgive. That's not even something I can comprehend. What kind of person does that? What kind of person looks a widow in the eye and lies for 15 years? She paused, her hands folded in her lap, age spots visible on skin that had weathered far more than time. "I got answers. I got justice. I got to bury my husband properly, but I didn't get those 15 years back. I didn't get to stop wondering. I didn't get peace when I needed it most." Reed took more than Arthur's life. He took my peace, my certainty, my ability to grieve properly and move forward. So no, I don't forgive him, but I'm glad he's in prison. I'm glad he lost everything he stole. And I'm glad that when he dies, everyone will remember him not as a successful businessman, but as a murderer who was too cowardly to even confess. That interview was conducted in 2003. Arthur's widow passed away peacefully in 2007, finally reunited with the husband who'd been 8 miles from home when death took him. Clarence Reed never confessed. Even after conviction, even after the evidence buried him, even after every appeal was denied and every legal avenue exhausted, he maintained silence. Not innocence. He stopped claiming that after the fingerprint evidence, but silence. Psychologists who studied the case found this fascinating. Most murderers, when finally caught, experience some form of relief. The burden of the secret becomes too heavy. They confess, they explain, they try to justify. But Reed gave nothing, no explanation, no remorse, no acknowledgement of what he'd done to Arthur or his family. Some interpreted this as sociopathy. Others saw it as pride, an unwillingness to give his victims the satisfaction of hearing him admit fault. But Detective Gilbert had a different theory. "I think Reed genuinely believed he deserved what he took," Gilbert said years later. In his mind, he'd worked hard for Arthur, he'd managed the farm, he'd made it profitable. And when Arthur threatened to expose the grain theft, Reed saw it as Arthur trying to cheat him out of what he'd earned. He didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as someone who'd solved a business problem. If Gilbert was right, then Reed's silence wasn't about hiding guilt. It was about refusing to apologize for something he didn't believe was wrong. That mindset, the ability to reframe murder as justified self-preservation, was perhaps more disturbing than the crime itself, because it meant Reed felt no remorse. 15 years of watching Arthur's family suffer hadn't touched him. The trial hadn't reached him. The conviction hadn't broken him. He'd simply been caught. And in his mind, that was bad luck, not justice. In prison, Reed kept to himself. He didn't make friends, didn't join programs, didn't seek counseling or spiritual guidance. He served his sentence the way he'd committed his crime, quietly, methodically, revealing nothing. Other inmates who'd shared cell blocks with him described him as cold and empty. One man who'd spent 6 months in an adjacent cell said Reed reminded him of a machine. No anger, no sadness, no nothing, the inmate recalled, like someone had scooped out everything human and left just the shell. Gave me the creeps. Reed died in prison in 2012 at the age of 75. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless. He never said Arthur Vance's name again after his conviction. Never acknowledged the family's presence at hearings, never responded to the letters Arthur's daughter sent, asking simply for an explanation. He took his reasoning to the grave, and with it, any chance for the family to understand the mind that had destroyed theirs. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps men like Reed don't deserve to be understood. Perhaps some acts are so calculated, so devoid of humanity, that seeking understanding is pointless. Arthur's children tried to find meaning in their father's death, tried to extract some lesson or purpose from 15 years of suffering. His daughter became an advocate for aviation safety. She worked with the FAA to develop better protocols for private aircraft security, particularly at small rural airstrips where access control was minimal. His son joined a victims' rights organization, helping other families navigate the legal system and cope with violent loss. They couldn't bring their father back, couldn't undo the trauma of not knowing, couldn't erase the betrayal of trusting their father's killer. But they could transform their pain into purpose, could ensure Arthur's death meant something beyond one man's greed and another man's suffering. The case itself became a teaching tool. Criminal justice programs studied it. Psychology courses analyzed it. Aviation safety seminars referenced it. The Bayou murder entered the lexicon of American true crime, not because it was the most brutal or the most famous, but because it was so calculated, so patient, so nearly perfect, and because it demonstrated that nature itself could be an investigator, that sometimes justice required not just human effort, but environmental change. That truth could be buried, but not destroyed. The drought of 1998 had lasted 3 months. 3 months of receding water levels, of exposed mudflats, of dried-up wetlands revealing what had been hidden. If it had lasted 2 months instead of 3, the plain might have remained buried. If the water had returned before that hunter noticed the metal tail section, Arthur might still be missing. The margin between justice and permanent mystery had been 30 days of dry weather, 30 days that changed everything. Arthur's granddaughter, born after he disappeared never having met him, visited the crash site in 2015. The bayou had long since reflooded. The exact location where the plane had rested was underwater again, hidden beneath cypress trees and Spanish moss. She stood at the edge of the water, trying to imagine what her grandfather's final moments had been like, trying to feel some connection to a man she'd only known through stories and photographs. "I wish I could have known him," she told a documentary crew filming a retrospective on the case. "But in a weird way, I feel like I do know him, because of how hard people fought to find out what happened to him, because of how much he was loved. Clarence Reed tried to erase my grandfather, tried to make him disappear without a trace, but he failed. Because you can't erase love, you can't make people forget." She paused, looking out over the dark water. "My grandfather is in every story my grandmother told, in every safety protocol that came from his case, in every family that got closure because investigators learned from his murder. Reed took his life, but he couldn't take his legacy. 20 years after the plane was found, Bayou Macon looks exactly as it did in 1983. Dark water, cypress trees, Spanish moss hanging like ghosts in the humid Louisiana air. There's no marker at the crash site, no memorial. The bayou doesn't acknowledge what it once held, but the people who knew Arthur Vance haven't forgotten, and neither has the legal system that finally gave him justice. The case remains one of the most studied cold case solutions in American criminal history, not because of dramatic courtroom revelations or last-minute confessions, but because of what it teaches about patience, preservation, and the long arc of justice. Detective Gilbert retired with the Vance case as his final investigation. When asked about his career, about all the cases he'd worked, all the crimes he'd solved, he always came back to Arthur. "Some cases haunt you because you can't solve them," he said in his last interview before his death in 2018. "The Vance case haunted me because it almost wasn't solved. If that drought hadn't happened, if that hunter hadn't been in exactly the right place, if the preservation conditions had been slightly different, Reed would have gotten away with it. That's what keeps me up at night. Not what we found, but what we almost missed." He paused, staring out the window of his retirement home, his hands folded on the table. How many other planes are out there? How many other victims are still waiting to be found? How many perfect crimes are only perfect because we haven't looked in the right place yet? Those questions echo beyond the Vance case, beyond Louisiana, beyond aviation murders, because the truth is, we don't know how many Clarence Reeds exist. How many people have committed calculated murders that look like accidents, disappearances, or natural causes? How many families are still waiting for answers that may never come? The FBI estimates there are over 100,000 active missing persons cases in the United States at any given time. Not all are murder, not all are even suspicious, but some percentage, no one knows exactly how many, are people who met the same fate as Arthur Vance. People whose killers were close enough to know their routines, patient enough to wait for the right moment, clever enough to make murder look like something else, and lucky enough, so far, to have nature keep their secrets. But nature is not loyal. Droughts happen, floods recede. Construction projects uncover burial sites, hikers stumble onto remains. Time and weather and human expansion constantly reshape the landscape. What is hidden today may be revealed tomorrow. What seems like a perfect crime may simply be a crime that hasn't been solved yet. For Arthur's family, that knowledge provides cold comfort. They got their answers, they got their justice, but they can't help thinking about all the other families still waiting, still wondering, still hoping that somewhere, somehow, the truth will surface. Arthur's great-grandson was born in 2019. He carries Arthur's name, Arthur James Vance III. He'll grow up hearing stories about a man who disappeared into thin air and was found 15 years later, 8 miles from home. He'll learn about betrayal and patience and the slow, grinding wheels of justice. He'll visit the cemetery where his great-grandfather finally rests, 70 years after taking his last flight. And perhaps he'll understand something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, that truth is patient, that secrets don't stay buried forever, that murder, no matter how carefully planned, leaves traces. Maybe not immediately, maybe not for 15 years, but eventually the bayou gave back what Clarence Reed tried to hide. The mud preserved what time should have destroyed. And justice, delayed but determined, finally found its way home. Arthur Vance flew 8 miles toward safety and never made it. But in the end, the truth traveled those same 8 miles and arrived exactly where it needed to be. In a courtroom, in a conviction, in a life sentence that ensured Reed would die in prison, stripped of everything he'd stolen, remembered not for his success, but for his crime. Some people say the Vance case is about murder. Others say it's about cold case investigation. Some focus on the forensics, others on the psychology. But really, the Vance case is about something simpler and more fundamental. It's about the fact that truth is heavier than lies, that guilt has weight, that secrets create pressure, and that, eventually, inevitably, something gives way. For Clarence Reed, it was a drought. For Arthur Vance, it was vindication 15 years too late. For the rest of us, it's a reminder that justice may be slow, may be uncertain, may depend on factors beyond human control. But it's also relentless. It doesn't forget. It doesn't give up. And when the waters finally recede, when the mud finally releases its secrets, when time finally exposes what was hidden, justice is still there, waiting. Just like Arthur Vance waited in that bayou, patient, preserved, ready to tell his story the moment someone was ready to listen. And in the end, someone was. The truth surfaced. The crime was solved. The killer was convicted. 8 miles from home, Arthur Vance finally made it back. Thank you for watching this story with us. If these accounts of justice and remembrance speak to you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered, please consider subscribing. We're building a community of thoughtful people who understand that every case matters, every victim deserves dignity, and every family deserves closure. Leave a comment below. We read everyone, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on Arthur's case. May his memory be a blessing, and may justice, however delayed, always find its way home.